Hi, my name is Patrick Newton. I am the distiller at Whisky, and today we're going to be going through and trying the Golden Oldies tasting set. So, you've obviously purchased the set. I want you all to open up the box, just take the sleeve off. Can be a little bit tricky. There we go. So inside each box you should get a tasting sheet like this, as well as the 4 whiskies we're going to try. So if you open up the tasting sheet, you'll see the 4 whiskies: the Sweetwater, Moss, Ceres, and Peat and Port. So what we'll do is we will put a glass on each of the positions on the tasting mat, and we'll go ahead and start pouring the whiskies out. So feel free to stop this video. I am going to go through it reasonably quickly, but if you want to take your time, just press stop, and then when you're ready to carry on, then we'll go to the next one. Right, the very first whiskey we will try is the Sweetwater. This is a non-peated single malt. It was distilled more than 5 years ago. As all of the whiskies we have produced, it's over 5 years old when we bottle it. The way that we made it was pretty simple. We had malted barley, we added water at 64.5 degrees Celsius. We converted all of the starch over to sugars. We fermented the water with the sugars in it to turn it to alcohol, and then we double distilled it through our 2 pot stills. It then went to age in an STR cask, which was a wine cask which we shaved the inside of it out so there was no wine residue in it. And then we got a blowtorch and burnt all of the inside. Essentially, we're making a new barrel with it. After a number of years, we pulled it out of the STR cask because it was getting quite dark in colour, and the aromas and the texture from that barrel was becoming a bit too much for the whiskey. We then popped it into a used bourbon cask, or a first fill bourbon cask, and we let it marry between the wood and the whiskey itself. Everything mellowed out, and here it is, the Sweetwater today. So you can see it's quite dark in colour. This is from the barrel maturation that we did on it. Today it seems to change from when I tasted it a couple of days ago. So for me, it's getting a lot of those orange blossom, marmalade characters coming through. I'm picking up a little bit of vanilla from the oak that we used in the bourbon cask. It's quite a complex whiskey. The savouriness of it is coming through. I can smell a little bit of cinnamon on there as well. So straight away, I'm getting upfront sweetness with it. I'm getting a lovely creamy texture. That's all coming from the bourbon cask that we used to finish it off in. And the length of it just keeps going. It does have a little savoury element towards the end, which I really enjoy. Makes it lovely and complex. So once again, 5 years old, non-peated single malt. Right, the next one we're going to try is Moss, and this is one of my favourites. We bottled this at 44%. When we decided what alcohol we're going to bottle each of the whiskies at, we will blend the cask strength whiskey into tank, and then we will pull a sample, and we will dilute different glasses down to specific alcohols. So at the start we'll have 40% alcohol, then 41, 42, and then right up to cask strength, which is normally around about 58% once it's had about 5 years in barrel for aging. Then we go through, try it, we decide where it's looking its best. So for Moss, it was between say 42% and 45. Then we diluted samples even more, so it was 42, 42.5, 43, and we narrowed it down to what we thought it was tasting its best at, which was 44%. Right, Moss. So for me, Sweetwater and Moss, I always talk about it being a very similar whiskey, made exactly the same way, similar barrel profile. So we put it into STR casks to begin with, and then we pulled it out and popped it into bourbon casks to mellow the whiskey out a bit. The only difference between the Sweetwater and Moss is the difference in malt we use. So for the Moss we used New Zealand peated malt, which we got from Gladfield, which is in Dunsandel, just out of Christchurch, where they harvest the grain there, bring it into the facility, malt it, and then they burn New Zealand peat, which is harvested sustainably down in Invercargill, and burn the peat through to flavour the whiskey, and this is how we get our peated malt. So same way it's made as the Sweetwater, just we're using New Zealand peated malt. So straight away I'm getting those medicinal characters which you get from peat. We tend to talk about opening a medicine cabinet and that smell. So very medicinal. I'm starting to get a few characters of Manuka coming through. If you go and have a look at any wetland in New Zealand, you'll quite often, you'll have New Zealand native plants, and Manuka is one of them. So I suspect that the plant material that started its life and then turned into peat over thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, Manuka would have been in that mix. So I can quite often smell it with a lot of our older whiskies, Manuka characters coming through. So I can smell it in this one. There is fruit behind the smokiness of the peat. I'm getting a little bit of pear drops, nectarine, and certainly we're getting a lot of those American oak influence characters. So your vanilla, your creamy notes coming through. For me, this is delicious. Upfront sweetness, the same as the Sweetwater, but it has a lot more texture to it. It's got a creamy nature, it's viscousy. I love it, and all of that peaty goodness is coming through on the palate. I think it's great. It's got really long length, complex. I think the marriage between the STR cask, the bourbon cask, and the whiskey is fantastic. One of my favourites. Alright, next whiskey we will try is the Ceres. This is a New Zealand peated malt. What we did was we put it in an American STR cask, so similar to the Sweetwater and the Moss. And after a number of years, we pulled it out and finished it in an Australian Apra cask, which is an Australian sherry cask. They can't call it sherry because it's not from a particular area in Spain, but essentially it's the same thing. The grape they used to make the sherry was Pedro Jimenez. So if you can imagine a PX sherry from Spain is very similar to a Apra PX sherry from Australia. Right. So straight away the difference I can see in this whiskey that you don't see in the Moss or Sweetwater is the level of spice coming through and the sweeter notes. And this is all coming from that sherry cask. Lots of marmalade notes, spice. I look at this as more of a Christmas cake whiskey. It's got all of the dried fruits, your raisins, or sultanas, figs, cinnamon, lots of those explosive aromas just jumping from the glass. The peat on the Ceres is lower than the Moss. I feel that having a lower peating level in this whiskey helps complement the rich aromas of the sherry cask. So it's a little bit lighter, still has those viscousy characters which you get from a heavier bodied whiskey. It has also got a lot of sweetness there. So the sherry, because it's a sweet wine, you'll start absorbing some of those sugars from the cask into the whiskey itself. It's got a little savoury edge to it at the end. Delicious. I would happily drink this in an afternoon, even if it's 30 degrees weather. It just is delicious. I think it's got great length and great complexity. It's one of the more popular whiskies that we sell here at the cellar door. Okay, final whiskey. The Dyad Peat and Port. There's quite a long backstory to this whiskey because it starts in the vineyard, a particular little plot on the Hawks Crest vineyard where a block of Tempranillo grapes was planted. To give you a bit of background, my previous job was a winemaker, and this particular plot of grapes, when I first moved to the Waiheke Island in 2012, it was a bit of an up and down vineyard because of rain. So Tempranillo grapes, if they get any sort of rain on them, the berry will swell up and split open. This happened in 2012 on Waiheke, where we got a big dump of rain right before, well, not quite before harvest, but about halfway through the ripening period. The grapes weren't quite ripe enough to make red wine. I made the call to go in and harvest the block to try and salvage it, brought it into the winery, made wine out of it to see if I could perhaps make a rosé. Once the wine was made, it wasn't good enough to turn it into or bottle it as a wine. So it sat in tank for a number of years. Then in 2014, Waiheke Whisky asked to lease space in the winery I was working at. And at that point, we had stills in the winery, and I thought, well, we've got all this wine, why not try and make some brandy? So we ended up distilling the Tempranillo wine, and then we put it to barrel. It was all French oak, and I pretty much forgot about it for a number of years. In 2019, just prior to the vintage coming along, I happened to see the barrels and thought, oh, we haven't tried this since we made it. Went through, took a sample, delicious. Fantastic brandy. It was complex, it had great length, lots of sweetness. And at that point I thought, in New Zealand, no one buys brandy. So the only other use for it would be to make a fortified wine or a port. So that vintage I made a port using Petit Verdot grapes, which was harvested just over the hill from the distillery, brought into the winery, treated it like a red wine, and then after 4 days during the fermentation, I added that brandy to kill off the ferment, basically to kill all the yeast off, so I'm left with a wine which has high alcohol and high sugar. I popped it into barrel, left it there for 1 year, pulled the port out, and then straight away I put the whiskey in, and this is the result. So it's a peated whiskey. We bottled it at 46%. It spent a year in port cask, and we pulled it out originally to make a whiskey just for Dramfest, which is a big whiskey festival held down in Christchurch every 2 years. It was very popular down there, and we decided, well, people are loving it, let's go ahead and bottle some more. So this is exactly what we did, and this is the result. So in the certain lights, you can see a very, very slight pink tinge to it, or more of a copper tinge to the whiskey. Straight away I can get those fruit characters from the port, lots of red berries, raspberries, strawberries. But I'm also getting a lot of those dried fruits as well, your figs and your raisins. So very sweet up front, has a lovely texture. I'm getting a lot of those red fruits coming through on the palate, and also peat in the background. So the peat part of the whiskey is not dominating the fruit, it's there in the background to add complexity and weight to the whiskey. Delicious. I think it's a great whiskey. It's drinking really well now. I think the complexity and the weight of it should be enjoyed by all. And that is the end of our tasting flight of the Golden Oldies pack. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you all at the distillery itself sometime in the future. Cheers.